This is Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Welcome back to the program. We're going to continue on from where we left off last week talking about assessments.
Yeah, we looked at vision, really the vision first, results now, and one of the real important steps we talked about was that it's great to have a vision, but we also need to keep touch with reality.
This is where a lot of visioning processes fall down. People get lost in their dreams, disconnected from the way things are. It's really the relationship between those two that generates the power to achieve results.
Right. So what we promised last time is that we are going to provide a real menu of assessment or problem-solving techniques and skills. So there's 8 steps that we're going to walk through here.
Did we get that number right in the book? I know there's somewhere in there we say there's 7 things coming up, and then there's actually 8. This could be it.
I think this one actually says 8, and it is 8.
Good for us. Okay, well, we're starting with making a current assessment. So that's just paying attention to what's really going on. This is where denial raises its head, and we can sugarcoat things or just refuse to see it.
Well, I remember working with a team one time, and they had a really cool vision, but they were unwilling to look at the fact that there were some things going on in the immediate future, or you could say even in the present, that were going to really trip them up. But they wanted to use positive thinking to kind of wish those things away. And this is a difference in terms of how we really use the visioning process.
Well, exactly. We champion the relationship between the way things are and the way we'd like them to be. In fact, I like to employ what's known as the Stockdale paradox, which goes this way: face the brutal facts of the situation, but never lose faith in the end of the story.
Right, so keep that feeling alive of what the vision is you want, seeing yourself having already accomplished it, but at the same time kind of enjoy the challenge of what might be in the way.
Exactly. So very practically speaking, that means taking an assessment of what is the current situation. That's step number 1.
Well, and step number 2 is a needs assessment. So what does the situation call for, given that we've just taken an assessment and we know what the deal is? What do we now need?
That reminds me of a story about a Boy Scout who returned to headquarters, and his uniform was all tattered and dirty, and he had a bruise on his forehead. And the Scoutmaster said, "What happened to you?" And he said, "Well, I was helping a little old lady across the street." And he said, "Well, yeah, but how did you get all beat up?" And he said, "Well, she didn't want to go." So I think that illustrates the point here. What is the actual need of the situation? She didn't want to go across the street. That wasn't the need she had.
Well, it's interesting. That reminds me, too, of a time when we were creating a program for a client, and we had this wonderful idea that we thought would be really cool for them, but it didn't happen to line up with what they wanted.
Small problem.
Yeah, so our pitch was really awesome. It just happened to be for a product they didn't want or care for.
We're laughing about this, and that's healthy, but actually it's kind of tricky. I mean, this happens a lot. We just do not see what the situation really calls for.
Exactly. Well, so let's assume for a minute that we're not that clueless, that we've learned from our experience, that we've taken assessment of what is. We've taken an accurate needs assessment. We realize, okay, here's some of the things we need. The next step is really interesting. It's kind of the other side of the equation of a needs assessment.
Right. This is called making an asset assessment. So you find out what's readily available to address your problems. You study what's immediately visible, and often when we do this, we get surprised. We discover, talents, skills in our colleagues we didn't know were there, or resources hidden in our infrastructure that we haven't been drawing on.
Right, and a lot of times what happens is while we're doing a needs assessment, if we're doing it well, people will actually start to offer, "Oh, hey, I know somebody who could help us address that," or, "Hey, I have that ability." So sometimes during the needs assessment, assets will actually start to appear, and that's why we have these two back to back, as they kind of one grows out of the other.
Exactly. Number 4, map the field.
So what the heck does that mean?
Well, I'm not sure, but it sure sounds good. Don't you think that could be like a poster, map the field? Well, here's what it means. Remember to telescope back for a perspective view so that whatever strategy you develop takes the big picture into account.
So this is how to overcome the analogy of can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, we call that forestitis.
Right. So we want to scope back far enough, broad enough to where we start to see more than just the myopic view of our own immediate desires or situation.
And we really advocate this as a habit, something to adopt all the time, even just to get up from your desk, go outside for a moment, look at the sky, take a few deep breaths.
Well, and a lot of times one of the other way to look at that, one is telescoping back. Another way is to think of it like a stream, is to go far enough upstream to be able to really start to understand what's causing certain things to happen, so that we can really have a better view of the downstream effects of the decisions we're going to make.
Exactly. Understanding the whole picture, not just little parts of it.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes, one of the ways to do that really falls into the next step, which is, step number 5. And that is being willing to create and manage and conduct both formal and informal focus groups.
And we all know the value of a focus group and the challenge. The value is we get different perspectives. The challenge is we get different perspectives.
Right.
Which may not be the same as ours.
Well, and it's interesting. We've done focus groups for decades, a couple of them actually, and that is one of the biggest challenges. Is you're never going to please everybody, but what you do want to do is find out whether you're basically on target or not. You might get some tweaks and changes, but is the focus group giving you back a sense that your perception of the direction to go to fill the need of the client or the project is actually correct? You could also do a focus group to help with your needs assessment.
Well, exactly. And then the art of communication comes into play, because we have to mediate between the different viewpoints. I had an experience the other day where I presented to a group and somebody gave me some feedback. And it was clear to me in listening to their feedback that they had some really good points that I was very grateful to learn about. They also had a bias in the way they were hearing me and listening to me. And really they would have preferred if I had done something different, but that related to their preferences and not really to the needs of the group. So then it was my challenge to take their feedback without being defensive, but also to do my best to communicate why what I had presented probably was better for the group, which, as we found out later, it was.
Yeah, that's what to do with the feedback from a focus group is always an interesting challenge. And, we get into this a little bit, actually the next one, so why don't we just roll it in here? That's the art of the question. Because in a focus group or with being able to just talk to people informally, being able to ask a question without loading that question up so people think you're actually looking for a specific answer.
Yeah, which is done so often and usually unconsciously.
Well, and it's sometimes even testing out your questions and seeing how does that question feel to people? How does it land?
Yeah.
We've all had political pollsters call us during an election and ask us questions, and sometimes it's like, well, I don't like either one of those answers.
Right. Well, of course, and I hate those questions that are asked this way. Now, there's no right answer. And of course,
however,
there is. There's something to be said for not just asking the question, but living in the question. Because so often questions are asked simply to get answers. Now, that may seem like the purpose of the question. You'd ask a question to get an answer. But really, we can expand our viewpoint on that. In terms of an assessment of what's really going on, the purpose of asking a question is to open up our vision.
Right.
So the way to open it up may not be to get an answer immediately. It may actually be better to stay in the question or add other questions in to keep opening up what has become kind of tunnel vision.
Yeah.
Because we are so focused on getting things done. Well, the questions can open that up. Well, why not ask another question or another and not be in any hurry to get to the defining answer?
Well, and it kind of ties back to something we covered in our last episode, and that was the whole idea of wondering, what if, right? What would it be like if this? What would it be like if that? What would you think would be a good way to go about this, and to really living in the question, I think is something hard for a lot of us because our culture is quite impatient.
Well, we're impatient and we're indoctrinated into the problem-solution paradigm. So it's like a knee-jerk reaction. So we say, well, what would it be like if we opened 3 new offices? Immediately we go into calibrating the effect of that, which is all just imaginary. But what if we did it a little differently? We said, or we heard someone say, well, what if we opened 3 new offices? And we just sat with that as a question and said, well, what if we opened 6 new offices? See, it's not
or
answering
one
the
new
question.
office.
Or one. Or what if we closed 2 offices?
Yeah.
In other words, nobody is expecting an answer to come from the first question. It's living in the art of the question, as we said in this point, and developing a perspective that isn't limited by our prior understanding.
Well, there's a CEO that I work with that does a really wonderful job with this, and what she will do is she'll ask something like, let's take the example you used. What if we opened 2 new offices? Now, I'd like you to think about that for a week.
For a week? Wow.
Yeah, and I want you to think of the ramifications of what that might have, both positive and counterproductive. Think of where might be the ideal places to open 2 offices, and if it's even a good thing. And then we'll get back together in a week, and I'd love to hear what you've thought about as you've progressed throughout the week.
What a great process.
Yeah.
And how does it work out for them?
Well, it saves them a lot of trouble because sometimes, inevitably, because she's got a really great group of executives, they will come back with thoughts and information and angles on it that she would have never been able to think of on her own, and even her executive team wouldn't have thought of.
Right. So let's expand our understanding about questions and answers from, A to B. Ask a question, get an answer, and see it more as asking questions to stimulate the imagination and invite in innovation.
Say that again. That was really good.
We see questions as a way to stimulate the imagination and invite innovation.
Wow. We should have included that in the book.
We should. Or make up our own poster.
That's right. Well, I think as we start to go down that road, I think that plays nicely into the next step, the 7th step, and that is really learning the distinction between positions and interests. So I know you've seen this play out in several situations that I know you were called in to consult and resolve some challenges. What did you notice people's tendency is to do with positions?
Well, if you can imagine someone with their arms crossed, body language always
Right.
communicates a lot. In other words, they're closed down, they're strong in their position, being defensive and aggressive at the same time.
Right.
Now, I call that kind of hopeless. You get a number of people, even 2, like that, and they're at loggerheads. They're not on the same page. So the first step is really to open up and just relax.
Well, and I think, again, part of the culture, grown out of the political climate, yes, grown out of sometimes business climate as well, is that our need to be right supersedes our willingness to find a solution. And so we hold firm to our position without even asking ourselves, well, what needs and interests does this actually address?
And how can someone else help me, and how can I help them?
Right.
It's an entirely different mindset from the kind of false independence, which is really an illusion, because none of us operate independently fully. We all have help.
Right. Well,
So shifting from that to more of a cooperative model where we actually expect to need help from each other, we welcome it, and we're happy to provide assistance to others. So it's, again, as we said in the title of this point, is moving from positions to interests.
Well, so I'm thinking back on I used to go in and do a lot of union and labor facilitation. And there's definitely some strong positions that are held in those situations. And to try to move people off from positions was practically impossible.
Yeah.
So one of the things we found really helpful was to go in, and if we look at what we're talking about here, we made a current assessment of what the situation was. What did people actually need?
Yeah.
What were they interested in and why? What assets were already available to solve that? Let's pull back far enough. We kind of walked through this, asking questions, doing focus groups, and then really starting to say, okay, now, given that these are the needs and interests of union and management, what are the ones we have in common?
Mm-hmm.
And what can we do to create a position that will actually solve or improve the interests and needs for both parties?
So in other words, identifying interests, shared interests, that would create a shared position.
Exactly.
Rather than the competing individual positions.
Right. So one shared position is that the company stays in business.
Right, which benefits everybody.
Right. And so another one would be that it might not appear obvious necessarily from the union point of view, but that the employees are happy and engaged.
Exactly. And often when there's conflict, positions battling each other, it's because emotion has overruled thought. In other words, the feelings about whatever it is are overwhelming the thinking.
As you're saying that, I'm reflecting on the step number 8. Have the courage to call out where we are wrong.
Yeah.
So it seems to be very easy to call out where somebody else is wrong. But I saw an amazing demonstration of this in a union and labor process. We had gone through these steps and identified needs and interests. And what happened was it started to become evident in this particular case that the needs of the union itself, the members, were different than the needs of the union president who was representing them.
Oh, really?
His need was to show that he was powerful and to, show that he could stand up against management. And the needs of the lower level executives were different than the needs of the senior level executives who wanted to show the stockholders that they were tough on the union. Mm-hmm. So we got into a meeting where with all the lower levels, we'd worked through a really great process together, and they were coming down to the final stages of this, and now the union president and senior management were in the room. One of the senior managers stated something, and his own executive stood up and said, "I'm sorry, but I need to call our attention to the fact that that's wrong." It was like you could hear the air suck out of the room, And he explained why, how that actually was going to defeat the good faith of the organization. And the union president wanted to jump on that, and his own union members stepped in and said, "No, we're not going down that road."
Now that's courage.
Yeah, so they really took their fate into their own hands and crafted a deal that they knew would work, and the leadership of both parties had to really get over themselves in order to allow that deal to go through, but gratefully it did.
Well, what a great story, and I'm glad it turned out well. What strikes me in it is that on the one hand, you had a couple of powerful individuals, and on the other, you had a group of individuals working together. And that really emphasizes the power of teamwork.
Well, and that's a really important part of this too, is when we're doing an assessment like this, that we don't do it in isolation, that we really involve people in the process. And we've probably talked about this before, but Toyota's process of nemawashi, it means digging around the roots of the tree to ready it for a transplant, right? And that the idea is that you've become familiar enough with the whole process that it needs to go through a change, that when you get ready to make that change, everybody's bought in.
Well, let's talk about that a little more. You've had such diverse experience with corporations all over the world, and I'm sure you've encountered many moments where in doing an assessment, in leading an organization through an assessment, they kind of get it, that, we have some things to change here.
Right.
I'd love you to talk a little bit about, really it's playing off our last point, having the courage to change whatever is required. What do you do in that moment where suddenly everybody's on board? They see the light. We've got to change things around here. And it may seem, and probably does seem, overwhelming in that moment.
Well, yeah, it can. And if we've done, this is where the assessment helps, though. If we've done the assessment well, we understand the needs much more, fully.
And it sounds like there's a reason that's up further at the beginning of the process.
Yeah, exactly.
To identify the needs as soon as you can.
Yeah, because then what is necessary to change. And when you're looking at the assets, what is available to help us. If we do that assessment well, then the reason for change starts to become quite obvious.
Yeah.
And then you can start to, break it off in bite-sized pieces and say, well, what needs to come first? Again, it's going far enough upstream to realize what needs to come first, what's the impact it's going to have on the next step. And if we've involved enough people in that inclusion process, then we're going to make decisions that are far better informed, and we're going to have the best thinking of the group in terms of how to carry out those changes and what some of the pitfalls might be.
Well, we wrote about this and we're talking about it and we consult about this because it's a problem area. It's something that people avoid. So let's talk a little bit about why is it that we don't do the kinds of assessments we should do?
I think there appears to be a cultural thing in some regards. I think rugged individualism is, a high value in Western cultures. And so we kind of feel like we should be able to do it alone. I had an example. I was coaching an executive in a pharmaceutical company that was opening a new manufacturing facility in Puerto Rico. And the Puerto Rican culture, like a lot of Latin cultures, tends to be much more collaborative and group-oriented.
Right.
So this leader who'd been shipped down from the mainland U.S. was there to kind of run things and get things in order. And they were going to go about this change, and he brought in one of the Puerto Rican leaders and said, all right, we need to make a decision here. Should we do this, or this? And the Puerto Rican leader said, well, let me go back and talk to my people, and I'll come back to you with an answer. And he said, if I would have wanted to ask your people, I would have. I want to know what you think. Demonstrate some leadership here.
Wow.
and the Puerto Rican leader was like, no, I really need to go back and talk to my people, because he understood that they knew things and would have perspectives that he didn't.
Well, and that was part of what he understood leadership to be.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's almost like he's wondering, is this mainland leader trying to throw him off course intentionally to test him?
Yeah.
Well, so the executive from the U.S. got really frustrated, and I met with him later that week when he was telling me about the situation. What can I do with this guy? And I said, have you stopped to ask yourself the question, is his approach maybe better? He kind of
what a great question.
He looked at me like, what do you mean? And I said, well, why would he be asking that question?
Exactly.
How are you interpreting? What's the story you're making up about his approach?
Right.
His story was, this is a weak leader who doesn't have strength.
Yeah.
I said, what's another story?
Yeah, right. You invited him to expand. Well, you're reminding me of a challenge I had many years ago. I was managing a couple of retail outlets up in Vancouver, and they weren't profitable. And there was a lot of concern about the direction the company was taking. And so I got hired on, and I got acclimatized, and I began to look at various things and found there was quite a resistance to look at what was going on. There was an assumption that sales needed to go up, we needed to do marketing and, reach different markets and so forth. But I was puzzled because we seemed to be doing pretty well, but we weren't making any money.
So sales were good, but the bottom line wasn't good.
The bottom line was suffering. So I took a day and I went and visited other comparable retail stores in the area, and I found that our prices were consistently 10 to 15% lower.
Interesting.
However, nobody knew this.
Oh, really?
We weren't capitalizing on it.
Gosh.
And I think what had happened is that over time, like 10 years or so, somebody had just lost track of price increases and hadn't increased the margin.
Wow.
They hadn't kept pace with increases in, the wholesale price. So I just presented, that I thought we needed to raise our prices. This was met with horror.
Sure.
We'd
Fear,
do
I'm
even
sure.
worse. Yeah, afraid we'd even... I said, well, I don't think people even notice, because they're not noticing we're cheaper right now. Sure enough, I raised prices, I think it was 12% or something across the board. A few things were left out. And life went on, except that we became profitable.
I've seen that happen
Really?
more than once. Yeah,
Really?
yeah, to where the pricing is out of whack. But again, that's because we aren't regularly assessing our current reality, right?
Yeah.
We're making assumptions. And if we go back and look at this, so we were talking about vision first,
Right.
creating a strong vision, seeing it, saying it, feeling it, jumping into the future and seeing it as already accomplished. But then this other piece of the equation is lining up with reality and being aware enough of reality that the demands of reality don't pull our vision back into the doldrums of now.
Yeah.
That we actually assess the current situation so that we can move it towards the vision.
Well, and I got to say, the key to this is on the emotional level, because we can be in our heads about it, but the more we actually assess something honestly, the more we'll add in the emotional component. Because it's one thing to say, well, we're not making enough money. It's another thing to confront the possibility of going bankrupt and needing to lay off 12 employees.
Right.
That begins to get us into our emotions. The habit is create the vision and assess the current reality. The experience can be moving from the head into the feelings, where you go, wow, I feel kind of depressed about the way things are. And then a moment later, I feel really excited about the possibilities and the vision.
Well, and that's the thing, I think, that the power of story, one of the first modules and episodes we covered, it deals with this, is that it's important to feel what we're feeling, but we don't have to be prisoner to our feelings.
Exactly.
We can actually say, and I've given the example of my wonderful friend Rick Jones, who when things would get tough, he'd get excited.
Mm-hmm.
He just trained himself to respond to difficult situations as, ooh, this is going to be exciting.
Well, it sounds like he was very emotionally literate, and a
Yeah.
lot of people aren't and haven't been taught that. For instance, I wrote in a book many, many years ago, used a little analogy. If you were to walk towards a cliff, you wouldn't, if you were a sane person, say, here is a cliff, I see the cliff, therefore I must jump off. An intelligent person doesn't do that. They might say, here's a cliff, I'm going to step back a step or two so I feel safe and enjoy the view. With our emotions, it's often like, well, I'm feeling despair, therefore I must get really depressed. No, it's like it's raining.
Right.
I notice the rain. I notice the despair, the depression. I can feel it without identifying with it and without jumping over the cliff. That's an important part of assessment.
Well, yeah, and part of the assessment is, too, to assess my own, physical situation. So I've mentioned before, maybe I tend to, depression hits me a little more strongly. When I feel it and I take that assessment, that tells me I need to up the ante in terms of my exercise, my meditation, and so on, so that I stay in charge of the outcome versus the other way around.
Well, I think this is a great way to end today's program, because ultimately the value of the assessment is that it gives us an incredible amount of information to help us track our way forward.
Yeah, so if you've got stories about assessments in your life, please send them to thrivingin.business.and life@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
I'm Will Wilkinson. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk with you again next week.